Hello and welcome to another mini lecture on CS200. In this one we'll talk about 9.9 through 9.11. So we're looking at constructors and some other properties of classes and objects. So let's begin by talking about constructor overloading. Overloading, as you know, is one in which we define multiple constructors with different parameter types. We talked about overloading different methods by having different parameter lists, and this one we also can do the same. So let's take a look at the example that they give, and in this case they have two different ones. But let's go to BlueJ, because I think BlueJ gives us a little bit better of an illustration. So here we have a constructor for restaurant, and notice this is in the restaurant class. We just say the name is no name, and we give the rating of -1. But we can have another constructor in which we can pass values. So you notice that there's two parameters here that aren't part of this. No, both are constructors named with the name of the class, restaurant, but in this case we're actually giving it two parameters. In this case, also we will set name and rating equal to what we pass in. So when I go to my restaurant, I've modified this to, first of all, we're going to call it without any parameters. So it should provide these two, right? No name and -1 will be set into these private field variables. And then we'll also call it, well, this is printing out that value. And then next, we're going to pass it some values, right? So this is the second type of constructor with two parameters. And we're also going to print out the values, and then this gets into what we had seen in the last section, in which we actually scan in and ask for user input. Let's go ahead and compile that. So we will run it here. And you can see here the first constructor without any values being passed in as parameters or arguments is giving us what we expect. And the second one, in which we pass in those parameters, the two, it actually uses those and constructs something using those two field variables. And then the third one, we just put in another one. So you can see here I've been able to create another one which we prompted the user for. So we have two constructors and one which we build based on user input. So again, that example shows us how we overload a constructor, and it's pretty straightforward. In many cases we will want to use the default, but it's also good to have one in which we can send different arguments to it to set it initially the way we want. So look through this example. If you don't define it the correct way, you can get error. And I would go through that example. Okay. So next we're going to talk about objects and references. So references are a little bit abstract. So it's a variable type that refers to an object. Okay? I would go through the example here. Here they have defined a reference, but it doesn't refer to any object when it's initially defined. So they have time, hour, minute, travel time. So what is time, hour, minute? What is travel time? They haven't really said it. So when we use the new keyword, it allocates memory for an object and returns a reference to that specific object. And again, I would go through the example here to see how that's allocated. Only when we call set hour and set minute, which are our setter, or these are our mutator objects, our methods, this actually changes the value. And notice it's tied to travel time, which we have as a reference because it was initially undefined. The new keyword ties it to a specific object, right? So it ties it to an object called time, hour, minute. And now we can set the hour and minute inside of it, and then we can print it out. I don't have a specific example other than this, what we see here in Zybooks. Okay, so what new does is it allocates memory, so that's what's going on behind the scenes inside of the memory or the stack. So it's allocating memory for a particular object, and then it returns a reference back to the location inside memory. Remember, we talked about pass by value and pass by reference. We said that primitive data types are done pass by value, but objects are done pass by reference. So this is an example where it's returning a reference to the object's location in memory. So it's just pointing to a location in memory. It's not making copies or duplicates of those particular values. So moving on to the next section, the this implicit parameter, I think is kind of important. So what it does is, in many cases, we have a private field, in this case side length, and then we have a method that has a particular, it has a parameter called side length. Well, it can be confusing to know which one of these two you're referring to. Are you referring to the one that's just tied to this method, this public method, or are you talking about the private? So it's important to know, in many cases, which of the actual values, if they have the same name, we are using. So in this example here, we have a class called ShapeSquare. And ShapeSquare has a private variable called sideLength. This is a field variable inside of class but outside of any method. Here we have a public method that says set side length, and then it's receiving a parameter called side length. But now notice that these have the same name, so it can get confusing inside of this method whether we're referring to the argument that was being passed in or whether we're talking about the field variable here. So what the keyword this does is this ties it to the particular field member, whereas in this case this variable here, and we're setting it equal to what's being passed in. So what this does is it reduces the confusion about which of the two we're talking about. Because just imagine if we didn't have that keyword and we had something like this. Now, it could be confusing if we're setting it if we're setting the field member equal to the parameter or vice versa. So again, here we don't have the this, so they were talking about the particular field. So we would have side length times side length. Because also we don't have a parameter, we don't have to worry about that. So we don't have to worry about using the keyword either. So again, I would look through this to look at reference variables and also how the this keyword makes a difference, because in this example here, it can be very confusing which hours we're talking about and which minutes. So this makes it very clear that we're talking about this one here. So it just makes it a lot clearer to us when we're trying to think through our programs. So remember overloaded constructors? We just talked about them. So that this can also help us. Notice that this, it sets, we have the elapsed time, and this is just basically setting the hours and minutes to 0. There's other ways in which we can do this, just like we saw in the past example, where we actually specifically said hours equals 0, minutes equals 0. But if we had a long list of variables or field members we needed to reset, it could be very cumbersome to do so. So this makes it a lot easier. So I would go through some of these examples if you're not familiar with them. But the implicit parameter, this, is helpful, and you'll see it quite often as we move forward in this course.